These people are about to experience what's called a crowd quake, where no one chooses to move anymore, but is moved, sometimes violently in all directions. And this isn't a one-off. Every year at the San Fermin festival in Pamplona, Spain, thousands pack into the Plaza Consistorial. And with densities of up to 9 people per square meter, think of 9 people in a tiny shower. The crowd no longer behaves like many individuals moving freely, but like a continuous material with moving patches that can exceed 10 tons. And these eruptions look different from what people probably imagine when they think of crowds as a classical fluid. So even though a crowd is made of individuals, like a fluid is made of molecules, and you can describe either one as a continuum, the macroscopic motion that emerges is odd. Because collectively, people introduce a sideways component, so they are not just pushed back and forth, but start oscillating in circular patterns, here with a period of about 18 seconds. And researchers found a differential equation that matches the oscillation statistics, which will tell us something interesting about ourselves and can be used to make concrete predictions, like the moment an exit is overwhelmed, that one's guiding pillar stops being a flow aid and starts shaping the crowd's oscillations, so it has to be designed for that too. Or when the ceremony begins and the crowd is split by a festive procession, the equations can then be used to estimate the new oscillation frequencies and whether the split stabilizes the crowd or not. And getting that right matters because when conditions are wrong, the same oscillations stop being harmless. On July 24, 2010, at the access tunnels of the Love Parade Festival in Duisburg, Germany, a crowd crush led to 21 people losing their lives due to chest compression that led to suffocation, and more than 650 were injured. And I remember the outcry here in Germany. Everyone was asking, how could this happen? Later, surveillance footage revealed that in the minutes before the disaster, the dense but calm crowd spontaneously developed the same type of collective oscillations. So while a crowd may appear dense but still calm, the process generating these oscillations may already be underway. The Love Parade crowd had already crossed a point of no return, a threshold where oscillations can spontaneously emerge on their own unless density is reduced. From that point on, at any time the instability can take over and the motion self-organizes. And it was through that same macroscopic lens, treating the crowd as a material, that they found something else. If you imagine a frictionless mass floating and connected by springs, you can get circular oscillations, but they are driven by inertia. The mass wants to keep moving and is merely redirected by the spring forces. And this could just as well be a membrane. The point isn't how the mass is distributed, but that the motion is driven by inertia. But that's not what happens in dense crowd oscillations. So while tons of people may oscillate, it's not inertia, as one might expect, that sustains the motion, but an active dissipative process. And looking at the individual level, escape can be deceptive. It can feel possible long after it actually isn't. Even when you can still move and navigate, you may already be past the point of getting out, and you don't know yet. On top of that, researchers identify force networks leading to vastly different loads experienced by different people, which becomes especially relevant at bottlenecks, where clogging produces slowdowns, like a more aggressively moving crowd escaping more slowly. And crowd disasters remain an ongoing tragedy. If you list them year by year from the late 20th century onward, almost every single year includes fatalities, mostly due to crowd crushes. Now there is active research, including unconventional approaches like using specific sound or light to subtly nudge a crowd from a distance, but corners keep getting cut, making it a matter of time until the next disaster occurs. So if you ever find yourself in such a crowd, is there anything that always helps? What can you do before things tip into dangerous motion? And if that moment is already gone, what can you do beyond the point of no return? Humans don't act as irrationally as the panic myth suggests. In the minutes leading up to the worst phase of the Love Parade disaster, you can see people offering each other water or checking in. And while there are moments of aggression from some individuals, what dominates the footage is endurance. When I talked to Manfred, who was only meters from where the fatalities were later reported, he remembered the pressure building in the final minutes. And I quote, "You have to understand, those last moments felt like being pressed against concrete, as if there were concrete there. You couldn't move at all. I mean, you could still move your head, but the rest, not even a little. But it wasn't concrete, it was people."
Man sieht neben dir eine Frau.
Later I asked him, "Right next to you a woman was almost going under the crowd. Was there anything you could do to help her?" And he remembers he couldn't help her, he couldn't pull her up. So for a while he just held her hand, that was all he could do. What do you do with someone you can't help? You talk to them so they don't lose hope. This is Manfred's footage, and together with hundreds of other crowd and surveillance videos, material like this became central in reconstructing what happened, both in public record and in court. Manfred himself appeared in court as a witness, and we'll use the footage throughout this video in the same spirit, to learn from it. Because even though the initial media narrative was to blame the crowd for irrationality, Manfred asked a question that stuck with me. How responsible is someone when they are trying to survive? How can you hold their behavior against them afterward? A rational plan has to include the last bit of irrationality, and the location in Duisburg was fundamentally different from earlier love parades. For instance, in Berlin, the surrounding Tiergarten could act as a buffer zone, but in Duisburg the festival area sat between a highway and a railway. So the first things you noticed as a visitor were two 80-meter wide access tunnels that fed into a single ramp toward the festival grounds.
So, would you route a mass event that previously drew over 1 million people through an 18-meter two-way corridor?
So when Manfred reached the ramp, he was met by two opposing flows. People entering through both tunnels, while others were leaving the festival area, slowly increasing the density. And besides some scaffolding on the other side of the ramp, and a container near the back, this small stairway seemed like the most viable escape route, so people were pulled toward it, creating the conditions for what's known as the faster is slower effect. So let's step back and really look at it from a researcher's perspective. Obviously, in research you don't want to recreate dangerous by endangering people, so a lot of what we understand comes from computer simulations. And simulating here means programming a rule-based, heuristic version of human motion. And if you've been following my work, that's basically what I do all the time, using simulations to dissect complex systems, from traffic waves to asteroid dynamics, by breaking them into simpler pieces we can reason about. And from what I hear, for a lot of people who want to use simulations, one of the biggest barriers is getting into programming in the first place. So before we continue at the next chapter marker, I want to thank boot.dev for sponsoring this video. It fits how I like to work, and I'm placing it here because we are already talking about the tools. And what boot.dev does well is that they make learning programming less dry by wrapping it in a story arc with role-playing game elements. So if you've been hesitant about getting into programming, you can just open their beginner Python course, for instance, and try the demo of the interactive elements. And I want to be clear, all their content is free to read and watch. And if you get stuck, they do have an AI tutor, but he is useful because he deliberately won't give you the answer. He nudges you back on track. Now, they do focus on backend development, which makes them kind of a rarity in the learn to program space, but the mindset transfers. Python, for instance, is useful far beyond backend work. Personally, I'm using boot.dev to learn Linux because I want to be more flexible when it comes to technical workflows, and somehow I'm typing into a terminal and it doesn't feel dry. So if you want to try it, go to boot.dev and use my code BrainTruffle for 25% off your first year on the annual plan. So back to the stairway bottleneck problem. How does a faster is slower effect come to life? Say, in abstract terms, a crowd wants to exit through a small door. At first, if people are considerate enough to give each other space, with mostly soft social forces at play, they can slip through one after another. But you can't expect that behavior once the situation turns competitive. If you imagine a danger zone slowly creeping toward you, and you feel like you might be caught by it, it's hard to slow down to let everyone escape calmly, even if in hindsight there would have been enough time, because you don't know in advance and you don't want to be the one finding out. So collectively people push harder and harder, and one social situation turns into a physical situation dominated by body forces. And Manfred remembers, you were completely powerless. Those last moments, the last 5 to 10 minutes, it was like concrete setting. You were inside it and it was impossible to move, below the waist and really even the upper body. It just didn't work. No chance. Even if you were half a meter from the stairs, even if you were on the very bottom step, you still wouldn't have made it. You just couldn't get out.
Und wie schnell hat sich die Situation...
And before it got to that point, did it build up slowly or happen all at once? He says, for the crowd I think it was gradually, a creeping process. People kept moving upward, and as that slow process continued, the crowd's focus shifted completely to the stairway. And that was the paradox the whole time. There were so many of us, this couldn't be the way out. It would have taken hours, maybe days to get everyone out through there. And the pressure just kept increasing. At first it felt strange, but not life-threatening yet. But over time, it kept getting worse. In physics, granular material can jam when it's just pushed hard enough. Tragically, a dense crowd can overwhelm an exit in a frustratingly similar way. Especially because it's kind of simultaneous what causes the jam, a rush toward the exit and dense crowd oscillations sending pushes from behind. So it's not the crowd choosing to do this. On top of that, the people on the stairway who'd already made it through turn around to help others, and the very urge to do good reduces the outflow. And again, you can't blame that either. It's the same instinct that makes people hand out water and reach down to pull strangers back up. So can helping become a bottleneck? Later, there's a police officer encouraging people to keep moving. This might sound crude, but if you make it through a bottleneck, keep moving or help while you keep moving forward, because stopping at the bottleneck reduces capacity, which indirectly increases the pressure on everyone still inside. Trust that help doesn't depend on you alone. And inside the crowd, try to reintroduce social behavior. But that's easier said than done. So this situation already drifted past the point of no return, because even when other parts of the ramp cleared, after police intervention, there was still a tunnel vision rush toward the stairway. As Manfred recollects, there was definitely this tunnel vision toward the stairway in the crowd, otherwise it wouldn't have happened. Those last 10 minutes wouldn't have played out like that. People would have moved out much earlier, because just 15-20 meters toward the ramp, everything was clear again, while inside, people were dying. Now, if we zoom out from this situation for a second, there's another factor you're not choosing. Sometimes you see pillars placed near exits, meant to guide the flow and reduce the risk of clogging, but they also add another contact surface which may concentrate stress. It's not a universal fix. Walls don't give like people do. A wall is like a mirrored crowd moving right back at you with tangential friction. It reflects pressure and can anchor force chains, which is why high dynamic loads often occur near walls. So if a wave is coming, whether it's a slow oscillation or a faster shockwave-like surge, try to move with it to stay on your feet and avoid getting pinned against walls. But often the only way out is toward the wall, so there isn't a right answer in the moment. And the real question is earlier. If you're about to enter a crowd that's getting denser and denser, at what point should you just turn around? And more importantly, at what point can you still escape? So let's really go and measure movement through a crowd, focusing on one person moving at a desired speed, making space by anticipating others, and then watching what happens as conditions become dangerous. This is the basic idea behind the so-called social force model, describing each individual's change in velocity, the acceleration, based on a set of rules. It's very similar in spirit to my car traffic video, where we also build an acceleration law from building blocks, except here it's person by person instead of car by car. And in general, there are two groups of forces in these models. There are social forces inspired by social norms, like attraction toward the goal, keeping distance, and steering to avoid collisions. And there are physical forces which capture things like ground drag or compressibility and friction once social forces lead to body contact. And astonishingly, even the simplest versions of the social force model reproduce many pedestrian phenomena, including the faster is slower effect. But there's another escape effect that makes you question whether you can even tell in the moment if you're safe. Imagine you walk straight into an oncoming crowd at some fixed average density. Up to moderate density, you can still anticipate people fairly easily and make progress against the flow measured by your velocity relative to the crowd. So as the simulation runs, at every moment you get a pair, your local density and relative velocity. And because we set the crowd's average density to a constant value, the local density you experience clusters around that value. Now, if we rerun the experiment for many different constant densities, you see that at higher densities you get more and more engulfed by the crowd until you're just carried along and your average relative velocity drops to 0. Of course, in reality, a crowd that dense wouldn't keep moving like this forever, but the point is, the crowd decides where you go. And all of that seems intuitive, but it can give a wrong feeling of safety. Because real crowds often aren't uniform. Take a standing crowd column strongly attracted toward one direction, say a bottleneck. People kept coming from behind and the crowd slowly compacted toward the front, with some people leaving from time to time. Now picture yourself at about 4 people per square meter. You might still feel okay, you can still move, thinking, if I need to, I can squeeze my way out. And if the crowd were static, that would be true. You'd slowly walk your way back, and as you reach lower densities, escape gets easier and easier. You're basically moving leftward on that density velocity picture. But if now new people keep streaming in, the whole density profile moves. So while you're trying to escape with your relative velocity, you also have to outrun a moving density front, because that 4 people per square meter contour isn't fixed in space. And if it drifts faster than you can move, you're moving rightward in the density velocity picture. You're already trapped, and you don't know yet. And if you rerun the experiment with people trying to escape from different starting positions, you can see that initial point of no return. Some people make it out more and more easily as they go, some never make it, and some look like they are making some progress until they don't. So just because you can still move relatively freely doesn't mean you will make it out. Now, one thing you often hear is, don't try to fight your way backward against the crowd, move sideways instead if it's an open space. And one more caveat, take the exact numbers here with a grain of salt. Like any simulation, they depend on the tuning. But what matters is that there's a point of no return, which can exist even for relatively mild inflows. We humans are good at local anticipation, like aiming for gaps. But here you'd have to anticipate the entire crowd dynamics, which is impossible to do from inside the crowd. And that's what makes it so deceptive. Everything unfolds calmly until suddenly it's too late. And Manfred remembers. This girl ran up. He saw her reach the top and suddenly she started crying. And in an instant he thought, wait, why is she crying? What's happening? And then he realized for some people they already can breathe. It's getting tighter and tighter, and for some it's becoming dangerous now. And then you start seeing it. People being carried over the crowd, someone trying to pull a person up by the leg. Those were the signs. That's when you realize something's going wrong. The pressure keeps rising, and for some people, it's especially hard simply because they are smaller. Now, say you didn't make it out. If the density is high enough, these circular so-called chiral oscillations can spontaneously emerge, adding an extra push to the crowd. So I wanted to ask Manfred what that felt like from inside.
Und würdest du sagen, der Druck kam weniger von Einzelnen, sondern...
Would you say the pressure came less from individuals and more from the crowd itself, even with people trying to hold out? And he says, yes, the pushing came in waves. There was this wave-like motion, like you know it from water. So it wasn't just individual people pushing, sure some individuals were pushing, but overall it felt like a huge mass that at certain moments would shift as one. And this is where the powerlessness becomes especially trapping. Other witnesses report a dangerous combination of wave motion and falling. When a group of people goes down in a crowd that dense, a small void opens, creating an asymmetric push on the people next to it, so they get pressed into the gap. And because there's no space to step, they can't catch themselves with their feet and slowly go down as well. But then people try to free themselves and some start to crawl over that tangle of bodies. Witnesses describe a pile where people were wedged in layers of up to 8 people. So once a crowd is this dense, any motion, any oscillation that can make you fall can very quickly become dangerous. It's closer to the edge of tragedy than we like to acknowledge. So where do these oscillations come from? A useful way to understand this is to recreate the effect with the simplest reasonable model you can find and then look inside that model and see what it's actually doing. And the obvious first step is to admit, from far away you didn't expect any single person to dominate the motion. Whatever happens, happens collectively, which is why it makes sense to treat the crowd as a continuum. And to be clear, the continuum view isn't a claim about what people are, it's about what you can predict at high density. It's the same move we make for fluids. A fluid is made of molecules, but in everyday life we describe it as a continuous material with velocity, temperature and density. And for a crowd it's similar. Instead of tracking thousands of individual people, each with their own position and velocity, you smear the crowd out into a density field and a velocity field where every point in space carries a density value and a velocity vector. And just like our agent simulation needed an acceleration law for each person, a continuum model needs a rule for how these fields evolve. So for a moment just focus on the velocity field. What you would expect to write down is something like the change of velocity in time, the acceleration of a moving patch in the crowd equals whatever forces you think matter. That's Newton's second law. And the velocity itself then changes position. And mathematically it's the same language as the individual model, except now you're applying it to a continuous material instead of individual people. But before we even talk about the forces, there's one odd feature of the continuum crowd model. Because in the model we end up with, the inertial acceleration term drops out. There's no mass or density times acceleration driving the dynamics, which is strange if you think about what inertia usually does. Consider a simple mass spring damper system like the one from my car traffic video. If you pull the mass, the spring pulls it back, the damper dissipates energy and you get that familiar overshoot. The system keeps moving because it's already moving. Again, that's Newton's laws of motion. Mass times acceleration equals all forces, which come here from the spring and the damper. And that's what you might expect in a dense crowd too. After a kick, people keep moving for a while simply because of inertia, while interactions remove energy. And for fast shockwave-like surges, inertia matters, and inertia-free models can miss some of the dynamics. But here's the point. If you take that same oscillator, increase the damping, and the oscillations disappear. And so the same differential equation produces a different outcome just by changing the damping. That's expected. What's less obvious is this. In the strongly overdamped regime, you can often drop the acceleration term entirely and get a simpler equation that behaves almost the same. And you can see why. If you inspect the relative magnitudes of the terms during the simulation, the acceleration term becomes tiny in the overdamped case compared to everything else. It hardly contributes to the evolution at all. So the inertial equation and the no inertia equation become nearly identical. You're taking a term that is already almost zero and setting it to exactly zero. And you might object, but if there's no acceleration term anymore, what changes velocity then? You don't need to, because velocity is itself a time derivative, it's a change of position with time. So you can rewrite it as a simpler differential equation that directly evolves the position, automatically implying a velocity change. And because this reduced equation is so close to the original overdamped one, the simulated trajectories stay very similar. And it turns out the same logic applies to dense crowds. The most reasonable macroscopic model also doesn't need inertia to explain the slow chiral oscillations. They are not carried by people's mass wanting to keep moving. But the final crowd model still produces oscillations, and in the simple oscillator picture, overdamping suppresses oscillations. So how can both be true? Well, there are two basic reasons. First, think about how many independent variables you need to specify to run our oscillator. If you give the position and the velocity at one instant, that's enough to calculate the acceleration, which tells you how velocity changes, which tells you how position changes. So position and velocity act like storage variables for the state of the system, which uniquely determine the future trajectory. Now compare that to the inertia-free overdamped model. Here velocity is no longer an independent choice, it's determined by the current position. That's why it can't oscillate in one dimension. At a given position it only allows one velocity. But back and forth means the same position must occur with opposite velocities. So by going inertia-free, we have thrown away a chunk of memory. That's the price you pay for simpler description. And that makes it sound like the inertia-free crowd model should also suppress oscillations, which isn't true because the crowd model has another storage variable, a second spatial dimension. The cleanest way to see this is to look at circular motion. A unit circle in the plane is just two coordinates oscillating with a phase shift. Here one traces a cosine, the other traces a negative sine. And negative sine and cosine are linked by differentiation. The derivative of cosine with respect to time is here negative sine, and the derivative of negative sine with respect to time is negative cosine. So if you identify these functions with the coordinates, you get a coupled system. The time derivative of x equals y, and the time derivative of y equals minus x. And that system of differential equations produces sustained circular motion. So to allow oscillations in the first place, it's not about inertia, it's how many state variables, here x and y, how much memory the model has. In fact, that two-dimensional overdamped system can be rewritten to look just like a one-dimensional oscillator. If you interpret the y-coordinate as a velocity-like variable, the equations fall in the same mathematical form. Now, even then, if you start exactly at rest, you still need something that pushes you onto that circle in the first place. And that something is the part where dense crowds stop behaving like passive material. Collectively, people behave like an active medium by constantly adjusting with little corrective steps. And here's an important simplification before we finally go into the forces. Once the motion breaks into a coherent chunk, you can treat it as a quasi-rigid patch, a crowd chunk, and just track its center of mass in the plane, as long as we ignore inertia. But the forces are still macroscopic. They are not interpersonal rules, they are continuum forces acting on that patch. So in the overdamped regime, without any mass times acceleration, the force balance includes a drag term that resists motion in the opposite direction of the velocity v, a restoring term that pulls the displacement u of the chunk back due to confinement, and most interestingly, a propulsive force p. And when you fit this to measurements, the model works best if that propulsive force is not treated as an instantaneous function of, say, the velocity. Instead, it has its own dynamics captured by its own differential equation. And the rate of change of the propulsion comes from a relaxation term that favors a force-free quiescent state, a windsock term that aligns the propulsion with the velocity until a saturation and can destabilize the quiescent state, a weathercock term which rotates the propulsion away from the velocity while keeping its magnitude constant, and a Gaussian noise term representing all the fast crowd movements. Overall, you get a chasing behavior. The velocity tries to follow the push, while the push keeps rotating away from the velocity. And that persistent sideways pushing creates the possibility of circulation. Now, in terms of the individuals, you can think of it as thousands of micro corrections just to stay upright, but collectively they add up to a push that never quite points straight. And that never quite straight is what turns drifting into circling. In other words, the crowd isn't just being pushed, it's steering itself under pressure. And because that steering has a sideways component, the motion doesn't just die out, it starts to loop. And you can push this reduction even further and calculate an effective potential valley, which implies a circular path the noise-free dynamics tends to settle onto. In that reduced picture, the final orbit is traversed at a constant angular rate. Now, importantly, the model doesn't hardcode a preference for clockwise or counterclockwise. That's interesting because in everyday pedestrian flow, you can get weak left-right conventions. People pick a side when passing. But here, the handedness isn't chosen by anyone. It emerges from a symmetry-breaking instability, which is a reminder that past a certain density, individual decisions get overridden by forces. And that also explains why it emerges spontaneously. Once the crowd is dense enough, the quiet state becomes unstable and the oscillation can suddenly take over on its own. And the data show there's a threshold. Below a critical density, about 4 ± half people per square meter, perturbations get dammed out. And above it, you can get a transition into coherent chiral oscillations, which means there are two different points of no return you should keep in mind. There's a microscopic one where you can't physically navigate out anymore, and there's a macroscopic one where the collective instability can switch on and start adding its own pushes on top of an already compressed crowd. And once that sets in, it takes time to unwind again, which is why early detection matters, for instance using frequency analysis. Because before the oscillations are visible, while the motion still looks mostly random, the kinetic energy spectrum already starts to grow a peak. Now, as important as all of this is, for most people, crowd safety will always be invisible work. There's no glory in prevention. And with increasing urbanization, dense crowds will show up more and more in ordinary places too. So if you ever find yourself in a situation like this, try to keep it social but with the physics in mind. And if you're ever on the planning side of an event, build margins, then double them.
Flüssigkeits-Gasforschung haben sie berechnet, dass die Personenströme, dass alles passt soweit.
Ja, haben sich verrechnet.
Ja, eben. So, das heißt, das sind ja keine Flüssigkeiten, um die es da geht, das sind Menschen.